market that falls in between perfect competition and monopoly. We're going to think about monopolistic competition. So if you look at the name here, monopolistic competition, you'll recognize that it is kind of a combination of monopoly and perfect competition. And so what we're going to see is that it is indeed kind of a little bit monopoly and a little bit perfect competition. And so we already kind of know a little bit about what this is going to look like. Let's think about where this fits in. We've got perfect competition, and we've got monopoly that we've talked about. Now we're thinking about a type of market, monopolistic competition, that falls in down here. Monopolistic competition. Now I'm not going to put like a little line there because this isn't a spectrum where that you hit some point and all of a sudden it becomes monopolistic competition. This is kind of a continuum. We can easily identify the endpoints, but the other things that fall in between there, we just know that perfect competition is not, monopolistic competition is not perfect competition. Okay? Actually, what we're going to see is monopolistic competition is very similar, or it's basically perfect competition, but the firms are going to sell differentiated goods. The goods are not going to be identical. So let's write out here the characteristics. So here are the characteristics of a monopolistically competitive market. The first one is there are lots and lots of buyers and sellers. Lots of buyers and sellers. Now that's the same as the first characteristic of perfect competition. Lots and lots of buyers and sellers. The second characteristic of monopolistic competition is that the goods are not identical. We're going to say that there are differentiated goods. Differentiated goods. So each firm is selling a good for which there are not perfect substitutes. There may be substitutes for the good, but they're not perfect substitutes. Okay? And then the last characteristic is that there's free entry, no barriers to entry. So you can see that this is a lot like perfect competition. These two characteristics are the same, but the firm's going to have some market power because it sells a somewhat unique good. It sells a differentiated good. So there is not a perfect substitute for what the firm is selling. Let's talk about some examples of this. So if we think about examples of monopolistically competitive markets, so if I were in a face-to-face class and I were to ask my students, give me examples of things that you buy. Most of the examples that I would get in that class would be examples of goods that are bought and sold in monopolistically competitive markets. It is by far the most common type of market. So if we think about examples of this, examples are things like restaurants. So if you think about, say, a pizza, there are lots of different places you can go buy a pizza. And basically, a pizza is usually round dough with usually tomato sauce and maybe some meat, some vegetables, some cheese on it. So that's basically what a pizza is. But if you think about it, different pizza restaurants each have a little bit unique pizza. So a Domino's pizza is not the same as a Papa John's pizza. It's not the same as a Pizza Hut pizza or a Little Caesars, or if you think about any of the kind of smaller non-chain pizza restaurants, they're all selling a somewhat unique good. Now it's not a lot different from what the other firms are selling, but it is different enough that each firm is going to be able to raise its price a little bit and not lose all of its customers. So if you think about all the different pizza options that are out there, if you like pizza, then you probably have a favorite. Well, what that means is you might be willing to pay a little bit more for your favorite than you would be for other pizzas. Okay? And so what we'll see is that each firm is going to face a downward sloping demand curve. They're able to raise their price a little bit and not lose all of their customers. With a perfectly competitive firm, because the goods were identical, if a perfectly competitive firm raised its price any, it lost its customers because there were perfect substitutes for what it was selling. So our examples: restaurants, consumer electronics. There are lots of different options for you to buy in terms of televisions. If you wanted a television, there are tons of different brands of television, but they're all basically going to do the same thing for you, but they're all somewhat unique. There's movies, clothing, let's say video games, books. There's all kinds of them. Furniture. And in all of these cases, there are lots of buyers and sellers. There's free entry. If you want to start a restaurant, you can. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that. If you wanted to make a video game, you can. I mean, you've got to get if you want to start a restaurant, you've got to get a business license. You've got to abide by the laws and pay your taxes and all that stuff, but there's nothing that prohibits you from doing it. So these are examples of monopolistically competitive firms. Now, let's go back to this idea that the differentiated goods gives each firm a little bit of market power. So each firm, let's say it this way, each firm has a small amount of market power. What that means is each firm faces a downward sloping demand curve for its product. Let's think about what that means. Remember that the elasticity of demand depends on the availability of close substitutes, and the more substitutes that are available, the more elastic demand is. So if we were to think about the demand curve that any particular firm faces, remember there are lots and lots of buyers and sellers. So if we were to think about the demand curve that a particular monopolistically competitive firm faces, because there are substitutes for its product, remember it doesn't face the market demand curve because it doesn't sell to all of the buyers in the market. It's going to sell to just a small sliver of the buyers. And because it has substitutes for its good, it's going to face a very elastic demand curve. But its demand curve that it faces is going to be downward sloping, and that means it can raise its price a little bit and not lose all of its customers. If it raises its price very much, it could lose all of its customers. But it faces a downward sloping demand curve, and we've got a name for the demand curve that it faces. We call it a residual demand curve. Each firm faces what we call a residual demand curve. Let's think about what that term means. A residual demand curve differentiates it from the market demand curve. Residual here, we're using the word residual to mean kind of leftover. So if you're one firm in the market, then you've got some customers that buy from you. But the customers that buy from you are the customers that didn't buy from somebody else. So you get kind of the leftover demand that's not satisfied by the other sellers in the market. So each firm faces a residual demand curve, and it's downward sloping. It is not the market demand curve. Not the market demand curve. That's important. Each firm faces a residual demand curve, not the market demand curve. Here's the nice thing. Because each firm faces a residual demand curve, and the demand curve that it faces is linear, we can use that rule that we know about drawing the marginal revenue curve. So we know that all firms maximize profit by producing the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Because the monopolistically competitive firm, and let's label this monopolistically competitive firm, this is just one of the firms in the market, the demand curve that they face is downward sloping. Our marginal revenue curve lies below it and has twice the slope. We know how to draw the marginal revenue curve already because of what we learned in our Monopoly chapter. So each of these firms has a very small amount of market power. It depends on how differentiated its good is. The more differentiated its good, the more market power it's going to have. Okay? None of these firms are going to have near as much market power as what the monopoly had because the monopoly faces the market demand curve. There are no substitutes for its good. Now, the firm still, as I just said, maximizes profit by producing the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. I said it in the last video, and I said it probably in the video before that. I'll say it again here. This is important. If you're not sure how to solve a problem, and it's a firm problem, and you're trying to figure out what quantity this firm's going to produce, you need to be looking for where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So we know exactly how to solve this problem. If we were to draw the cost curves for this monopolistically competitive firm, so again, let's label this monopolistically competitive firm. Let's put our marginal cost curve up here. Let's go ahead and put the average total cost curve in here. Now, we've got our cost information. Let's add our revenue information. What we're really interested in is the marginal revenue curve, but let's put the demand curve that this firm faces. Now remember, it's pretty elastic because there are substitutes for this firm's good. But because it's downward sloping, we know that the marginal revenue curve has the same intercept and twice the slope, so I'm going to draw it. There's my marginal revenue curve. The firm is going to look where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That happens right there. So this is the quantity that the monopolistically competitive firm is going to produce. I'll call it QMC for monopolistic competition. Once the firm knows what quantity it's going to produce, it's going to use the demand curve to figure out what price it's going to charge. It wants to charge the highest price that consumers are willing to pay for that quantity. So if we go up to the demand curve, we get the price. There's the price the monopolistically competitive firm is going to produce, or is going to charge. And hopefully you see that this is the exact same picture that we talked about with Monopoly. Everything is the same. The only difference is that because this is monopolistic competition, we know that this is not the market demand curve, that's a residual demand curve. Okay? If this was a monopoly picture, that would be the market demand curve. So this is just one of several firms that are in this market. If this was a monopoly, we would have a picture of the whole market because there's only one firm. Because this is monopolistically competitive market, we've got a picture of one of the firms, but there are other firms. Okay? But the picture itself and how you find the right quantity and the right price is the exact same process as what we did with Monopoly. You look where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that gives you the quantity. Then you go up to the demand curve, that gives you the price. So this, at least how you solve the problem, is exactly what we did with Monopoly. How you figure out profit is exactly the same as what we did with Monopoly. So we've got the quantity, we've got the price. I'm not going to draw it in here. You can go back to that previous video if you want to see how to figure out profit. But all you need is the average total cost. Right there would be the average total cost of that quantity. We draw a little dashed line over here, and that area would represent the profit that this monopolistically competitive firm earns. Let's talk about, before we think about the difference between the short run and the long run, let's also talk about the fact that the monopoly has no supply, or the monopolistically competitive firm has no supply curve, for the same reason that the monopoly has no supply curve. The firm still makes a supply decision, but we can't label any of these curves S and call it the supply curve, because we need the marginal revenue curve, we need the marginal cost curve, and we need the demand curve to figure out quantity and price. So the monopolistically competitive firm has no supply curve for the same reason that the monopoly has no supply curve. What we need to do now is we need to think about the difference between the short run and the long run. So let's go back to monopoly for a second. With monopoly, we didn't worry about the short run and the long run. The reason is that there's no entry in the long run with monopoly. There are barriers to entry. With this type of market, there is free entry. There are no barriers to entry. So what's going to happen is, if we've got a monopolistically competitive firm that's earning a positive profit, then in the long run, other firms are going to enter that market. And what we'll see is that that profit gets driven to zero. So what we need to do is clear this off, and then we'll take a look at what that looks like. All right, let's think about what's going to happen in the long run if a monopolistically competitive firm, or if the firms in the market are making a positive economic profit. The way we want to do this is we want to think about what would happen to the demand curve that we face. Let's suppose we owned a firm. Let's suppose we owned a pizza restaurant. Let's think about what impact we are going to experience if another firm enters the market. So if we think about what's going to happen to demand for our product, if another firm enters the market, if you think about it long enough, you'll probably realize that demand for our product is probably going to fall. And it might be easier to think about it the other way around. Let's suppose that we are one of several pizza restaurants in town, and one of the other pizza restaurants leaves the market. Then that's probably going to mean more customers for us, right? So if another firm leaves the market, our residual demand curve is going to shift to the right. So if we draw a picture of the residual demand curve that we face as a firm, I'm going to draw it fairly elastic. Since we're talking about monopolistic competition, I'm going to draw it a little bit flatter than I would if we were talking about monopoly. So if this is the residual demand curve that we face, then if another firm enters the market, the residual demand curve is going to shift to the left from, say, D1 to D2. This would be the effect of entry into the market. Okay? Or if another firm left the market, then that is going to increase the residual demand curve that we face. So exit will cause our residual demand curve that we face to move to the right to, say, D3. Now let's stop and think about that for just a little bit. Because if I didn't talk about this, everybody would probably say, okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense, and nobody would stop to think about the possibility that that shouldn't make sense to you. Because if you go back and you think about probably the very beginning of your very first introduction to the demand and supply model, we would have talked about the determinants of demand, the things that shift demand curves. Hopefully you remember them. Realistically, you might not. So let's review what the determinants of demand are. So if we think about the determinants of demand, these are the things that shift demand curves. Determinants of demand, these are your income. When your income changes, your demand for goods and services will change, and it depends upon whether or not for you the good is a normal good or an inferior good. So income, a very important determinant of demand. Prices of related goods, that's another very important determinant of demand. Prices of related goods. Another one is your preferences. Another one's your expectations about the future. Buyer's expectations. And then there's a fifth one. And the fifth one is the number of buyers in the market. Number of buyers. Now, let's think about this. When I taught you the determinants of demand, these were the 5 determinants that we talked about. That is not consistent with what we're doing in this picture. What we're changing here is the number of sellers in the market. Now, the number of sellers is a determinant of something, but it's a determinant of supply. So if I didn't talk about this and you went home and you were studying this like I know all of you do, every evening you go home and you get out your economics textbook and you read through it and you review the stuff that we've already done. And if I hadn't explained to this, when you're reviewing tonight and you go back and you review the determinants of demand, you'd say, wait a second. That's the number of buyers, not the number of sellers. Why is it that today, when we were shifting a demand curve, we had the number of sellers changing a demand curve? That's a determinant of supply. Well, here's what it boils down to. This is a residual demand curve. This is not a market demand curve. These are the determinants of demand, but here what we're thinking about are the things that shift a market demand curve. The things that shift a residual demand curve include all of these things, but the number of sellers in the market also shifts the residual demand curve. So if we think about our residual demand curve for pizza from us, the demand that we face from our consumers, then if consumer incomes go up and pizza's a normal good, that will shift the residual demand curve to the right. So this determinant of demand also shifts the residual demand curve. As a matter of fact, all of these, if consumers like pizza more than before, for whatever reason, their preferences for pizza change so that they want to buy more pizzas at every price than before, then that's going to shift our residual demand curve to the right. Or if the number of buyers in the market changes, if a lot more people move to town, then that will shift our residual demand curve to the right. So all of these things still shift residual demand curves in the expected way. It's just that now we've got something new that shifts a residual demand curve, and that's the number of other firms that are in the market. Okay? So it's important not to get confused here and not to think that all of a sudden the number of sellers is a determinant of market demand. It's not. It never has been, it never will be. But it is a determinant of the residual demand curve. Okay, so now let's think about what happens if the residual demand curve shifts. Let's suppose that we've got a decrease in residual demand. Let's draw the residual demand curve here. We'll call it D1, price, quantity. And let's draw the marginal revenue curve that goes with that residual demand curve. Let's call it MR1. Well, if the residual demand curve shifts to the left because there's entry into the market, so let's shift that residual demand curve to the left to D2. Then what's going to happen is that our marginal revenue curve is also going to shift to the left, because remember, your marginal revenue curve always has the same intercept as the demand curve. So that marginal revenue curve is going to also shift. It's going to shift to MR2. So when our residual demand curve shifts, the marginal revenue curve goes with it. Now, once we understand this, that entry will shift a residual demand curve to the left, and exit will shift a residual demand curve to the right, now we can see what's going to happen to a monopolistically competitive firm if it's earning a positive economic profit. So let's draw a picture of what's going to happen here. Let's start with a picture of a monopolistically competitive firm earning a positive profit. Okay, so I'm going to draw this picture relatively large because we're going to be cramming a lot of stuff into one picture. So when you're drawing your notes, it would be useful to draw a big picture. That way you don't get a small picture and you're trying to find intersections and tangencies and all of that in a small picture. Let's go ahead and put our marginal cost curve up here. Let's put our average total cost curve. And let's put it, I don't want to put it too high, I don't want to put it too low. I'm going to put it somewhere right kind of in the middle like this. There's my average total cost curve. Okay. Now I want this firm to be earning a positive profit. This is a monopolistically competitive firm. and I want their profit to be positive. So I'm going to put the residual demand curve up above their average total cost curve. So I'm going to put residual demand somewhere like that. Now remember, it's fairly elastic, so you don't want to make it flat. You don't want to make it perfectly elastic, but you don't want to give it a lot of slope either. Now our marginal revenue curve has the same intercept and twice the slope, so I'm going to make it come down like that. I'm going to call it demand curve 1, marginal revenue curve 1. Let's make sure we label our axes. This is price, this is quantity. So we've got a monopolistically competitive firm. Let's identify their quantity first. We're going to look where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That happens right here. We're going to call it Q1. Let's identify their initial price. So we go up from that quantity to the demand curve. We hit it right there. So there's P1. Let's go ahead and identify at least the rectangle that would give us profit. So we've got, remember, profit is equal to price minus average total cost multiplied by Q. We've got price and quantity. We need the average total cost. So we go up from that quantity to the average total cost curve. We hit it right there. There's average total cost 1. Now, profit is going to be the area of this rectangle. I could shade it in, but I'm not going to because we're going to be doing some more stuff on this picture. But the area of this rectangle would give us profit. The vertical distance is price minus average total cost, that term, and the horizontal distance is quantity, that term. So if you take a vertical distance times a horizontal distance, you're getting an area, and that's the area of that rectangle right there. This is a firm earning a positive profit. I'm going to label, let's label our initial point right here, point A. Okay? And let's put our story here. We're going to start at 1, or excuse me, start at A. Price is equal to P1. Quantity for the monopolistically competitive firm is equal to Q1. I just meant to write Q equals Q1, but I've got Q1 equals Q1. Profit is positive. Now, if this was a monopoly, that's the end of the story because there's no entry in the long run with a monopoly, but it's not a monopoly. This is a monopolistically competitive firm, and there's free entry. So in the long run, because profit is positive, other firms will enter. In the long run, because profit is positive, other firms enter. Now, as other firms enter, this firm's residual demand curve that it faces is going to start to shift to the left. And as its residual demand curve shifts to the left, its marginal revenue curve comes with it. So let's draw with a different color a residual demand curve that has been shifted to the left. Now, I'm not going to draw the end of the story here. I'm going to draw you a residual demand curve that's been shifted to the left, but the firm is still going to be making positive profit. I'll show you the end of the story here in a second. But let's suppose that entry is taking place, and so the residual demand curve has been shifting to the left, and let's suppose it shifts this much. So we get this leftward shift of the residual demand curve to D2. Now, as that residual demand curve shifts to the left, the marginal revenue curve is coming with it, and our marginal revenue curve shifting to the left is going to end up at marginal revenue curve 2. Now, let's think about what's happening here. Now, our intersection between the marginal revenue and the marginal cost curves is right here. So the firm, as the residual demand curve is shifting to the left, the firm is going to be reducing the quantity that it produces down here to Q2. Let's think about what's going to happen to price. So demand for this firm's product is decreasing, so we would expect them to be able to charge less than before, which is exactly what happens. The firm is going to charge the highest price for Q2 that it can get, So we go up to the new demand curve, and that happens right here. The price is going to fall to P2. Now let's think about what happens to average total cost. Now remember, this average total cost curve is U-shaped. So as we move in this direction, average total cost is rising. Now, in my picture, I didn't move very much, so average total cost doesn't go up very much. It's going to be right there, which is a little bit higher than where it was. I'm just going to extend it over here, put a little line there, and that's going to be average total cost 2. But now notice what's going on. The area that would represent profit, I'm going to shade it this time, it's this area right in here. That rectangle would represent the profit that the firm earns, and you can see that the profit that they earn is smaller than what they earned before when we were at point A. We could call this now point B. So let's add to our story here. As other firms enter, residual demand decreases. I'm going to abbreviate that. Residual demand decreases. Quantity falls to Q2. Price falls to P2. And profit falls. Now profit is still positive. Price is still greater than average total cost. So profit is still positive, so the entry would continue. And the residual demand curve is going to continue shifting to the left. Quantity will continue decreasing, price will continue falling, average total cost will continue rising, and that will continue until price and average total cost come together, at which point profit is equal to 0. So this continues. Let's just say right here, here's the last step. This continues until profit is equal to 0. Now let's look at how that's going to happen, and this is kind of challenging with this picture because it's already complicated. But this residual demand curve is going to be shifting to the left, and what's going to happen is it's going to shift enough that it ends up being just tangent to this average total cost curve. Now that's hard to see in this picture because it's complicated. So what we need to do is I'm going to clear this off, and then we'll draw a picture of what the end point looks like. And then it'll be easier to see how price and average total cost have come together. Let's draw another picture here, and let's think about what the end of this story is going to look like. So we've got our marginal cost. I'm going to draw my average total cost curve, and I'm going to give it, I don't want it to be big and flat and sweeping like that. I'm going to give it a nice bowl shape like this. It's average total cost. And I'm doing that just because it'll be easier to make the picture look like it's supposed to look. So if our residual demand curve is up here, then the firm's going to earn a positive profit. And entry is going to be taking place, and that residual demand curve is going to be shifting to the left. And it's going to shift to the left until it ends up being just tangent to that average total cost curve. Now, let's finish. I'm going to go ahead and extend this up to my vertical axis there. Now, I need to draw my marginal revenue curve that goes with it, but in order to make this picture look the way it needs to look, we need to be careful about where I put my marginal revenue curve. So this point is going to be where my price is. This is going to be my quantity. Now for this to be the quantity, my marginal revenue and my marginal cost curve, this is the demand curve, my marginal cost curve and my marginal revenue curve need to intersect right there. So if I go from here down through that point and I make that my marginal revenue curve, now I've got an accurate picture of what the end of this process is going to look like. So the residual demand curve is going to shift to the left until it ends up being just tangent to that average total cost curve. And at that point, the price and the average total cost will have come together, because notice that if I go up from this quantity right here to the average total cost curve, I hit it right there. Average total cost is equal to price right there. This is a situation where we've got a monopolistically competitive firm earning a profit equal to 0. This is also what we would call long-run equilibrium in a monopolistically competitive market. Long-run equilibrium, where our firms are earning 0 profit. When profit's equal to 0, there's no incentive to enter the market. There's no incentive to exit the market. You would never exit the market unless profit became negative. Okay? So this is kind of the end of that process where we had the complicated picture here, and that residual demand curve was shifting to the left. It's going to continue shifting, and our price is going to continue falling, and average total cost is going to continue rising until they come together, and that happens when the residual demand curve has shifted enough that it's just tangent to that average total cost curve, and at that point the firm is earning 0 profit, and there's no incentive for other firms to continue entering, no incentive to exit, so we've got a long-run equilibrium. What we need to do is we need to ask this question: is profit equal to 0 inevitable in the long run? Think about what we've just learned. So in the Perfect Competition chapter, we talked about the fact that profit gets driven to 0 in the long run. We have to remember that that's economic profit. So that means that everybody's next best employment alternative is covered. Okay? Same thing here. This is economic profit. So we're not saying that people can't put food on their tables. We're saying that profit is driven to the point where its revenue is just big enough to cover your costs, no more, no less. And those costs include all of your implicit costs in addition to your explicit costs. Okay? So is a economic profit, let's put that in here. Is economic profit equal to 0 inevitable in the long run? And the answer is yes. The key to earning a positive economic profit is that your price needs to be bigger than average total cost. And unfortunately for firms in this type of market, there's free entry. So if there's ever a difference between price and average total cost, if price is ever more, then that's going to create an incentive for other firms to enter. These firms can't stop those other firms from entering, and the profit gets driven to 0. So let's talk about ways that the 2 things the firm might be able to do. 2 things the firm can do. So let's suppose that your dream, and I tell my face-to-face classes this all the time, let's suppose your dream is to start a restaurant, or I don't know, to start a bar. And here I come and I trample all over your dream, because I've just told you that if you're going to enter the restaurant business, you need to be prepared to earn a profit equal to 0 in the long run. Now that's economic profit. There are way worse things than economic profit being equal to 0. What I always tell my students is that I'm not trying to destroy anybody's dream. I'm not trying to tell you that you shouldn't pursue something that you've always wanted to do. But you need to be prepared for the fact that your profit will be driven to 0 in the long run. Now there are 2 things that are at play here. There are 2 things that you could do to try to change this. One of them is that if you could get your residual demand curve, the demand curve that you face, to shift back to the right, then once again your residual demand curve would be above the average total cost curve and your profit would be positive. So the 2 things the firm can do. One is to try to increase the demand curve they face. Let's say it this way. Try to increase the residual demand curve they face. What that means is you could try to further differentiate your product. That's really what we're talking about here. Further differentiate your product. So that's the first thing you could do. The second thing you could do is you could try to shift your cost curves down. If you could get these cost curves to shift down, then it doesn't matter if the residual demand curve stays right where it is. If you could shift the cost curves down, then your price would once again be above average total cost and you would make a positive profit. So the second thing you could do is decrease costs. Let's say decrease cost of production. Both of those things would result in a positive profit. Here's the problem. Even if you're capable of doing these two things, if your profit becomes positive, in the long run, other firms will enter that market and your profit's going to go to zero again. So you would have to try to continually do these things. Let's start with this one, decreasing your costs. That's hard to do, and there's a lower bound on it. You can't decrease your costs to zero. To run a business involves incurring some costs. And so this, you can do it, but other firms can also do that, and so that's challenging. At least you're eventually going to reach a point at which you're as efficient as you can get. The other thing that you can do is to try to rebrand yourself. As a matter of fact, if you've ever seen the TV show Bar Rescue, where John Taffer comes in, and basically what he does is he visits bars that are in trouble, bars where they're earning a negative economic profit, they're losing money. And if you think about what John Taffer does, it's this. It is exactly this, right? The first thing he does is he comes in and usually some people are going to get yelled at, right? And maybe somebody's going to get fired. And once you get past that, there's some crying and some people are mad and there's almost always somebody that's way too drunk. But basically, once you get past that first day, then they get down to business, and here's what John does. He starts looking at inefficiencies. He looks at ways to reduce their cost, and there's always ways that you can do that. Usually, what's happened is somebody's hired their drunk uncle, and their drunk uncle is just drinking up profits, and they don't have a POS system, and so he installs that, and he looks at ways to make the behind the bar area much more efficient. Maybe it involves having a couple, 2 or 3 stations where people can make drinks, and essentially that allows them to be more efficient. So he attacks this, decreasing costs. And then the other thing he does is he attacks this, right? He rebrands the place. You can't take a failing business and just try to keep doing the same stuff over and over. You got to try to turn it into something new, something that people are curious about, something with a new idea. And so he does exactly these two things. And what ends up happening is, at the end of each episode, there's always some information there at the end about how much better they're doing. And that's great because, you know, they've attacked the two things that you need to attack in those types of markets. What I'd love to see, though, is what happens in 3 years? What happens in 4 years? Because staying efficient is challenging. You've got to have a really good manager or multiple good managers to stay efficient. And I'm betting that most of these bars, they get lax and they start going back to their old ways, and their costs of production start to sneak back up. And then, you know, you can come up with a great new idea, but other people, if you've come up with a good idea, other people come up with their good ideas also. So if you come up with a new drink, or you come up with a new game, or you come up with, I don't know, new decor, well, in 2 years, everybody's used to the decor, and other bars have come up with their own games, and now your drink is not new anymore. And so I've heard John Taffer say that you probably need to rebrand every couple of years, maybe every 3 years you need to redo this, come up with something new. It's right out of this playbook. He's a genius because he knows exactly what needs to be attacked. And if your plan is to run a business, these are the things you need to pay attention to, right? So I don't want to step on anybody's dream and say that, man, your profit's going to be driven to zero because there's nothing you can do. This is what it's going to look like. Well, if you're good at this, and you've probably been in places that have been very successful for long periods of time, and sometimes it can be really hard to put your finger on exactly what it is that makes people like a place. It's possible. There are bars and restaurants and other types of monopolistically competitive firms that are really good at staying efficient and kind of coming up with new ideas, or maybe they've hit on an idea that it's really hard to duplicate in other places. A lot of times it's the owner, right? It's the owner that's friendly and establishes a rapport with customers, and you'll see that in a lot of those bar rescue episodes. It's the owner that is the thing that's keeping them from being successful. And turning that around, you can do that. It's easy to do that, I'd say, in a week, but staying turned around, that's a challenge. And so if you want to see this in action, watch a few episodes of Bar Rescue. I would love to have John Taffer come be a guest lecturer in my classes, because he can explain this stuff every bit as well as I can. Let's talk for a second about comparing monopolistic competition to perfect competition. And we can do this with a picture that's very similar to what we did with Monopoly. Let's draw a picture right here of a perfectly competitive market. Actually, let's draw a picture of a perfectly competitive firm. And then right here, let's draw a picture of a monopolistically competitive firm. Monopolistically competitive firm. Quantity, price. So what we've seen here is in both types of markets, profit is driven to zero. So let's draw a picture of long-run equilibrium in both of these markets. Now the cost curves are not different in both of these markets. We've got our marginal cost and average total cost, and those don't depend on the type of market that the firm's in. The difference lies in the marginal revenue curve that the firm faces, and that comes from a difference in the residual demand curves that the firm faces. Both of these firms face a residual demand curve. We didn't talk about that with a competitive firm, but they do face a residual demand curve, and it's perfectly elastic at the market price. And what we know is that in the long run, that market price is driven to this point, and our marginal revenue curve ends up coming along here. It's horizontal, and we end up being right there. The firm produces this quantity. Here's the market price. And what we see is that a perfectly competitive firm ends up producing at the efficient scale. Now we see something different with a monopolistically competitive firm. The residual demand curve that it faces is downward sloping, and so we end up with a tangency right here, right there, between the residual demand curve and the average total cost curve. And this ends up being our quantity. This ends up being our price. Right here's where the marginal revenue curve comes down and intersects the marginal cost curve. So we end up with that picture with a monopolistically competitive firm. Now we can compare both of these. We can use this picture to see what the monopolistically competitive firm is going to produce compared to perfect competition, and what price they're going to charge compared to perfect competition. What we see is the monopolistically competitive firm uses what little market power it's got to restrict quantity and drive price up. But now it's not able to drive price up very much because it doesn't have very much market power. And you can see that the more elastic this demand curve is, the closer our tangency is going to get to that point. And if it becomes perfectly elastic, then we're right there. Okay? So the flatter this demand curve, the less the firm is able to restrict quantity and drive price up. Now we've got a name for this. The quantity that the monopolistically competitive firm produces is right there, QMC. This quantity, I'm not going to label it, but that would be the perfectly competitive quantity. And this difference right here between the perfectly competitive quantity and the quantity the monopolistically competitive firm produces, we call excess capacity. We say the firm is producing at excess capacity. What that means is they are not producing at the efficient scale. They are producing a quantity that is smaller than the efficient scale. In other words, they're producing in a plant that's a little bit too big for them. Now, they're not doing anything wrong. They are still maximizing their profit. But the way the incentives work, it's encouraging them to produce a quantity that is a little bit too small for the plant size that they've got. And so their average total cost is going to be a little bit higher than it could be. That's going to create some deadweight loss. We also see that the price that the firm charges, a monopolistically competitive firm, is a little bit higher than the price that would be charged by a competitive firm. And that creates some inefficiency there. We've got price greater than marginal cost. We call that the markup over marginal cost. We saw the same thing with monopoly. Markup over marginal cost. So this firm, these monopolistically competitive firms, are using their market power to restrict quantity and drive price up, but they're not able to do it very much. Okay? So in terms of production, we've got some inefficiency. The firms are producing at excess capacity. That creates deadweight loss. In terms of consumption, price is driven up above marginal cost, and the quantity is restricted below what would be produced in a perfectly competitive market. And so we get some deadweight loss from that. So just like we saw with a monopoly, the presence of monopolistic competition creates some deadweight loss. But let's think about that. It's not all bad, though. We've got some deadweight loss, but think about what's going on here. We're thinking about perfect competition in terms of deadweight loss being zero, right? Deadweight loss is zero, but notice that we probably wouldn't want to live in an economy where every market was perfectly competitive because all the goods are the same. One of the nice things about monopolistic competition is not all pizzas are the same, right? You can go out and you could go out in town and buy 20 different types of pizzas. You could go to a bigger city like Kansas City and buy 200 different varieties of pizzas, all somewhat different. There's a pizza for everybody. And that's a good thing. Product variety makes life interesting. And so even though some deadweight loss is created in this type of market, there's a lot of product variety, and that's something that we get well-being from. So it's not the type of thing that we look for government to step in and try to fix this deadweight loss. Let's also think about what's going on in this picture. In this picture, what we're seeing is that profits equal to zero. Monopolistically competitive firms in the long run are going to earn a profit equal to zero. If the government were to step in and force the monopolistically competitive firm to do something different to try to fix the deadweight loss, then their profit will turn negative, right? If the monopolistically competitive firm, given the freedom to choose its own quantity and its own price, still earns zero profit, then if the government forces them to choose any other quantity or choose any other price, their profit has to be negative. And they end up going out of the market in the long run, exiting the market. So even though these firms have a little bit of market power, they are not able to use that market power to turn it into positive economic profit in the long run. And the thing that works against them is that free entry. When there's free entry, your profit's going to get driven to zero, because if it's ever positive, other firms are going to enter. Now, in terms of trying to shift your residual demand curve to the right, what we're seeing here is that in this type of market, there's going to be a very strong incentive for firms to engage in marketing. That's something we have not talked about in our previous videos. So we talked about perfect competition. We've talked about monopoly. With perfect competition, you don't see advertising. You don't see an individual farmer running ads on TV to buy their corn. The reason is they know that that would be ineffective. Consumers treat the good as if it's identical. So any dollars they spend on an ad trying to convince you that Farmer Bob's corn is better than everybody else is wasted money. In monopoly, we don't see advertising, or at least we don't see very much. We do tend to see a little bit of advertising, but it's kind of unusual advertising. I don't think De Beers is running them anymore, but De Beers used to run some commercials that said nothing more than a diamond is forever. And every once in a while, back when those commercials were running, a student would ask me, they would say, well, that just seems like a waste of money, because they're not telling you who to buy your diamond from. They're just saying diamonds are forever. Well, they don't need to tell you who to buy your diamond from, because if you buy a diamond, you're buying a De Beers diamond. So all they need to do is tell you to buy more diamonds. If they can convince you to buy more diamonds because they've got a monopoly or a near monopoly on the market, you're going to be buying one of their diamonds. So in monopoly, you see a little bit of advertising, but it's kind of unusual. In this type of market, restaurants, movies, books, clothing, electronics, we see tons of advertising. So the question is this: all of that advertising that gets done, is it productive or is it not? And that's a legitimate question to ask, and there's not really a nice, clean answer for it. I would say, most economists would probably say that it's not all or nothing. There's some advertising that is beneficial, and there's some that's not. If we've got firms that are trying to tell us that their good is better than other firms' goods, when in fact it's not, I would argue that that's probably misplaced resources. We could use society's resources better than that. On the other hand, if there's a better product out there, if there's a better restaurant, if there's a better television, then I'd like to know about it, because I like to use my money in the best way possible. And so advertising tells us when there's a better product. You can, kind of a safe bet is that if a firm's going to engage in, spend the money to advertise, there's a decent chance that they've got a reason to do that. If their product's better, they're going to want to spend the money to tell you that it's better. That's not always true, but sometimes it is. So I would say that some advertising is good, some marketing is good, some is a waste of resources. So like a lot of things, it's not all, it's not nothing. There's also value in having a brand name. Firms have an incentive to protect their brand name, and you protect your brand name by protecting the quality and the integrity of your product. So there are some people that would argue that having brand names that the business can protect legally is wasteful, and maybe some of it is, but I would argue that if you're in an unknown town, let's say you're traveling and you come into a town and you don't know what the local restaurants are like, but you see a McDonald's, well, McDonald's may not be the greatest cuisine there is, but you know what you're going to get. And so that has some value. You may not choose it. You may be thrilled by the idea of driving into a new town and trying a brand new restaurant, and sometimes that may pay off. Sometimes you're going to get restaurants that are just terrible. But if you want to avoid that and you want consistency and you want to know what you're going to get for your money, having that brand name has some value. So it's similar to marketing. Some brand name protection maybe is wasteful in terms of society's resources, but much of it is probably not. So this gives you an idea, hopefully, of how the most common type of market structure works, monopolistic competition. Firms have some market power a little bit, but they're not able to turn it into a positive economic profit. What we've got to do now is we've got to talk about the last type of market that we're going to think about, and that's an oligopoly. And an oligopoly is where there are just a few firms. Because there are just a few firms, what we're going to see is that strategic interaction between those firms is really important. So we need to talk about game theory in that discussion. So I'll see you in that video.